All right, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Chuck Hayward. I'm from the University of Colorado in Boulder, part of a little group called Ethnography and Evaluation Research. And today I'm going to be talking about how to support instructors in transitioning to IBL. And this is going to be some lessons from the IBL workshops. Our group, myself along with Sandra Larson and Marina, who some of you may have met in the past years, have evaluated some workshops hosted at the IBL centers. So I'll talk about those in a second. But before I get into it, I want to just give a little framework for what I'm going to be talking about by talking about a theory of change. So this theory has 3 stages to model instructor change, which I like because they're pretty easy to remember. So the first one, the unfreezing stage, an important process, is the process where instructors start to feel a difference between the goals they have for themselves and what their instructional methods are achieving. And they start to not line up, which gives them a motivation to change. Also, a really important part of this stage is that they have to feel safety to change in a new way. So as they start exploring and looking at new methods, they have to feel that the method they find, in this case IBL, is consistent with the view they have of themselves as an instructor, which I think is an important point that we'll get into. In the next stage, changing, where instructors learn, apply these new methods, and then also reflect on what they're learning. And then the final stage is the refreezing stage. So after they've tried this new method, the refreezing stage is where they get some confirmation that it's working, and they solidify it and keep using it rather than just going back to their old methods. So this is kind of how I'm going to frame my talk today, and how we can support instructors at all 3 of these stages. So before I get into that, I just want to start. Some of you may know that before I got into research, I taught middle school. So this is a picture of me teaching here. It may look like I was a PE teacher, but that's actually because I taught at a school about 3 miles from here called the Girls Athletic Leadership School. So part of our philosophy there was that physical activity can support learning. So we started our morning with my mic go off? Oh. We started our morning with a class called Movement, where everybody, teachers and students alike, did some physical exercise together. And then we incorporated it throughout our day. So for example, this is where I taught my students about rates by using physical competitions, an Olympic style competition, and that's their great gold medal they got there on a paper plate. So when I found out that active participation was going to be a theme for this workshop, I said, I got this, I can do this. But sadly, that's not what they meant. So instead, we're going to start with a little group activity. So what I want to do is, using these 3 stages, I'd like to see if in small groups you could identify an important way to support new IBLers at each one of these stages. Obviously, for number 2, you could say workshops, but since that's what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to ask for that one that you think about a feature of a workshop that may help support instructors in changing. So what is it about the workshop that makes it successful, not just that it's a workshop? So we're kind of split in half. Let's say front row of tables can start with number 1, second row number 2, and then those of you in the back can start with number 3. Let's just spend 2 minutes at your tables, and you can see if you can talk and come up with some ideas to support instructors. All right, so I know your discussions are still going, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move along here. So I just want to hear kind of what you said. Let's get 1 from each group. And like I said, I taught middle school, so I have no problem cold calling, and avoiding eye contact won't work. So somebody from group 1, any ideas for how to support instructors with the unfreezing stage?
We were talking a little bit, following from the last round of presenters, on the importance of mentoring in order to provide a safe space for new instructors, so that they have someone that they can go to when something goes wrong, or they need to ask a question about how to approach a particular part of that instruction.
Great, yeah, it was actually a nice segue from the last session I was here. So cool, thank you. Group 2, how about changing? Maybe a feature of the workshop?
We basically said the same thing that they did with mentoring, that we said, I've gone to a conference in the past where you were assigned to a group and each group had a mentor. And so that was somebody who, after the conference, stayed in contact with you to offer support and motivation for you to keep going with what you'd learned at the conference.
Okay, great. Thank you. And group 3? Anybody had a refreeze, although you kind of mentioned following up with with the mentor?
Harry Lucas, retired. I'm not sure I'm group 3, but in the last session, which was good by Ellie Kennedy, it was mentioned 3 things that are anti-American, maybe, and need to be changed. One is failure, it's okay to fail. Second, confusion, it's okay to be confused. And 3, when I am confused, what's the first thing to do? And the answer is nothing. And nothing is anti-American. Sitting quietly and doing nothing. And this all came up because of the plenary session. I finally realized that what they said was an equation was not an equation. And by sitting quietly and rereading the thing, rereading the problem, things started to click. So these are 3 things that maybe are a change from the normal high school or undergraduate program.
All right, thank you. I'm glad you commented, actually, Mr. Lucas, because I'm going to talk briefly about the project this is involved, which has been supported through EAF and Mr. Lucas. So these workshops were hosted by the IBL centers. As I mentioned, they were supported by Mr. Lucas, but also through an NSF grant. So there were 4 centers. Each one hosted a workshop across the 4-year span. Each of them was 4 to 5 days long. In total, they served 167 participants, and most of them were pretty new to IBL. They all had their own flavor, but shared some mix of invited talks, discussions, videos or observations, expert panels that you could ask questions of, in some cases, hands-on exercises and work time to develop their own courses. Most of them also had specific content-focused sessions, so how do you do IBL in a calculus class? How do you do IBL for pre-service teachers? Those type of things. So part of our work, we did pre-workshop, post-workshop surveys, and then also 1 year later we do follow-up surveys. So we only have those collected for the first 3 cohorts. The 4th one will be collected this fall. And we also did interviews with 16 participants for the first 2 cohorts. So I'm going to use findings from those 2 things to talk about how to support new IBL instructors. So real quick, as far as implementation of IBL from our 1-year survey, we found that our conservative estimate, so not counting those that didn't respond, we're saying that we don't know if they implemented it, at least 58% have implemented some form of IBL in their classrooms in the year following the workshop, which is quite good. And it may actually be a little bit higher, since you can see there's 34% that we didn't hear back from and we're not sure if they do or not. Okay, so the next slide here, you're gonna see a lot of data. I'll walk you through it real quick. Just so you can kind of get the big picture. So what we have here is the frequency of different instructional practices. On the left is before the workshop, on the right is on the 1-year follow-up. Basically the length of the bar tells the percentage. The darker the shade, the more frequently it's being used. So, significant changes we see. These are ones highlighted in green. So these are kind of your core IBL features. We see decreases in instructors lecturing, decreases in instructors solving problems, and then increases in student-led discussions, small group discussions, and students presenting problems or proofs at the board. So those were all significant differences from pre-workshop to 1-year follow-up. The next 4 here are characteristic of active learning, but not necessarily IBL, and we saw no significant changes in those, and actually very little change if you look at the bars from pre to 1-year follow-up. Then the last 2 I haven't talked about, highlighted in orange, these are kind of what I refer to as IBL choice activities. So instructor-led discussions and student group works. Some people that use IBL will do these, others won't. In these cases, we saw increases that were not significant for both of these 2 practices. So what this tells us, I'm going to skip this slide. I can get into that more later if you want, just in the interest of time. So what this tells us, this stage of unfreezing, one of the things I mentioned was feeling safety and being able to envision a change that allows you to be consistent with your own view of yourself as an instructor. And the feature that we think is really important here is that there are broad, inclusive definitions of IBL. It's not necessarily one specific method, but it's more a toolkit of different methods that you can implement. A great quote from the interview that I really like here. The conference kind of showed us that there's a whole spectrum to IBL and that it is okay to find what works for you, and that doing something that doesn't work for you is not going to work, even if it works for someone else. It was kind of a big moment for me because it made it seem less scary. The MORE method is something that I don't feel comfortable applying, but feeling like I can pick and choose aspects of it and find something on the spectrum that I feel comfortable with was empowering. So again, seeing IBL as a choice for how much you have to do and what different practices makes it more accessible, and it's an easier entryway. All right, so moving on to stage 2, once they've kind of made that decision to change and try something out, aspects of the workshops that supported instructors in making this change. So one thing about the workshops is that they covered some very important IBL concerns. If you're here for the panel of new IBL instructors, they touched on a lot of these concerns, but they also provide strategies to help with these concerns. So, big one, skill to implement IBL. How do I assess it? How do I structure my content? How do I manage student presentations? All those kind of skills. Some of the workshops call them the nuts and bolts sessions of IBL. You have to teach instructors how to do those things. Another one that comes up a lot is the idea of coverage. When you teach IBL, if you go really in depth, it slows things down usually, and coverage can become an issue that you're not getting through as much content as you feel you need to, which I'll touch on again in a second. And the last one, student resistance. For a lot of students, this is a big change from the math courses they're used to, and they may be resistant to it. You have to help the students through that. So part of helping instructors is how do they manage that and how do they support students in making that. So a caveat about these strategies need to be tailored to and appropriate for each individual's context. So what that means is if you only show it, kind of this goes back to the safety broad inclusive definitions again. If you only show one way, it may not work for different students that have a 2-year versus a 4-year liberal arts like the plenary we heard versus a proof-based course. It comes out in things like coverage. If you're teaching a class that doesn't serve as a prerequisite, you might not have to worry about it. That's not going to help somebody that's teaching calculus say, oh, it doesn't matter, right? You need to tailor it so that it works for the people that want to use it in their institution, in their situation. So one way that works is by having a diversity of perspectives at the workshops. Having different people speaking, different people presenting from different institutions, different contexts that help the participants feel I could do this at my institution with my students. Also, the workshops involve active participation, which we found to be very helpful through discussions and expert panels, also work time to develop materials, provided lots of time for participants to do stuff. A week of sitting there and listening to talks would probably be a little bit much. So this really seems to help participants stay engaged and learn a lot. Also related to that is the time and duration of the workshops. Time meaning that they're a week long. Duration meaning that with the week, you have time to revisit things throughout the week. It's not just one real short thing. You have time to kind of maybe learn about a topic on day 1, think about it, get back to it on day 3. The length helps. It allows people to discuss, to process and digest. Also, very importantly, allows them to build relationships. You spend a week with people, you get to know them pretty well, and that carries on into the third stage. So the third stage, refreezing. One thing I want to mention about this is maintaining the change, solidifying it, make sure you don't just go back to the old methods. So if we look at implementation rates across the 3 years, we see that it's actually significantly higher for the third cohort in 2012. One feature of that goes into that refreezing that I think is an important feature of that workshop and contributed to that high implementation rate is that they provided lots of follow-up. So this group, the year after the workshop, they set up an email group and would send messages to say, hey, how's it going? What are you struggling with? Check in, let us know what's going on. Lots of follow-up with them. And you can see here is a graph of the daily activity on the email list. I don't know if you can see, but kind of the orange ones are where the organizers prompted and said, hey, how's it going? Check in with us. And you can see a lot of times you find an orange one and then a flurry of activity from the green, the participants checking in and saying, getting the conversation going, and then becomes a little less dependent on the organizers as it goes on. So that follow-up seems to be really important. This is one way that the workshops have done this. There's also some other ways that aren't necessarily characteristic, but have come out of our interviews and the research we've done. Some things that these can include are inviting the participants into the larger IBL community. So ways they can do that, invite them to attend this workshop, or IBL-related sessions at the joint math meetings or regional meetings or Math Fest. Bring them in, getting them to be part of the community and connecting with different people, yourselves, everyone involved here, can be really good. And that happens for some. AIBL mini grants, we heard that come up for a lot of people as a good way to support them in implementing it and maintaining developing IBL courses and things like that. Another way, connecting with IBL colleagues or mentors. I know we mentioned that from discussing, you said mentors were important. We find that too, it's important not only in helping you feel comfortable to try it, but also to maintain it and help you through the difficulty of teaching your first IBL class. And then one other example I want to mention here, we did hear that there was a group that kind of started a small little regional group of IBL practitioners where they'd get together, and they said, we met before the semester started, 2 weeks in, 2 weeks after that, and then since then it's been about once a month to chat about different things and to share books and to discuss stuff. So this is a way that they support each other in implementing IBL with this little regional group. So just to summarize real quick here, unfreezing, we find that it's important that you represent IBL with a broad, inclusive definition to help instructors with changing to IBL, address the big three, as I call them, the coverage issue, student resistance, and then the skills to implement, or the nuts and bolts. Also the features of the workshop: active participation, diversity of views, and time and duration to process and build relationships. And then refreezing, ongoing support through follow-up, and then also inclusion in the larger IBL community. So that's it, but before I end, I just want to say thank you to NSF for providing the money for these workshops and our evaluation work, which is also supported by EAF. Provided us some money, it's a very generous grant to do this analysis and present here today. Then our workshop organizers at all the IBL centers, and all of the respondents that put up with my pestering to complete the surveys and do all that. So thank you to everyone involved. And I guess that's it for me, if you all have questions.
Did you find in the interviews or follow-up surveys that there were things about the workshops that were ineffective?
Yeah, some of the things that we found were, I highlighted the things that worked. Some of the comments were, well, I wish there could have been more of this. I don't think there were necessarily things that were ineffective, but there were people saying, it would have helped to hear more from community colleges or something like that to make it more applicable. But that did seem to be a thing that helped with the workshops, was having diversity. And then some people said, I could have used a little more of this. So all in all, they were pretty effective. I mean, 58% is a pretty high implementation rate, but there was some room for improvement too. So. And then hopefully we can use this to improve the next generation of workshops, which are running next week, actually. So.
This was an excellent presentation, and the questions were good. My question is, do you need a critical mass of somewhat experienced IBL people at an institution in order for a person to try their first course? Sandra may have some comments on that. And one good solution might be the monthly luncheon of IBL people, where you can kick ideas around with your friends and see what works and how to approach things.
Yeah, as far as the lone individual doing IBL, that does happen in some cases. It can be more of a challenge, but that's where we find things like this meeting being very helpful to support them. The regional group could be a thing like that, where if there's one person at this institution and one an hour away, they could get together and support each other. There are ways to work around that. It does add some challenges. It might be easier to have that critical mass, like you said, but there are some ways to support individual instructors, or maybe 2 or 3, and that don't necessarily have as much institutional support. I will say that sometimes on pre-surveys, people said, oh, I'm worried my department won't like this, but we actually found very, very little on the post-surveys and follow-up. It was not very often that they said they had any problems with that. So it seemed to be more of a concern going in, but not many problems once the instructors implemented IBL and tried it out.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you recruited the instructors into the program and any incentives that they may have had?
Sure. So these are the workshops. Like I mentioned kind of when I talked about them really briefly, they were all had their own kind of way to do it. Some of them used MA Prep to recruit people that way, sending out emails through different communities, advertising at the joint math meetings, the Room conference, they were, advertising there. In some cases, somebody would attend in one year, and then, the next year, 3 of their colleagues would come, or, different things. So it's kind of word of mouth at this point. There has not been a problem filling the workshops. So it's just kind of, advertising and getting the word out, but there's not necessarily, Project Next, sending emails to them, lots of different ways, basically whatever you can think of, trying it out. But each workshop did a little differently for these. So.